Hello, everybody. Good to not see you. I know you can see us. We have a panel with members of very different backgrounds today, whose books cover a lot of ground, and so I'm going to just introduce them in alphabetical order. So starting with Catherine Bruns. She is a former newspaper reporter and a USA Today best-selling author who writes the Cookies and Chance mysteries, the Italian Chef mysteries, and the Cindy York real estate mysteries. She's a Daphne du Maurier Award winner for her book For Sale by Killer. And she says that she wrote her first book, which was a highly plagiaristic version of Cinderella, when she was 8. And fortunately, Disney never sued. But you know what? They might like to think they invented her, but Cinderella was around a long time before Disney.
Good to know.
Yeah. Okay, Danna. She's a scientist by day, specializing in infectious diseases. Now, how topical is that?
Well, yeah, I do COVID, so very.
Yeah, exactly. So she works in a dynamic research group at a cutting-edge Canadian university. However, you will not be surprised to learn that her true passion lies in mystery writing. And she has 2 series, the NYPD Negotiators Thriller series, whose first book, Exit Strategy, came out this past July. And with Anne Vanderlaan, and I hope I said that correctly, she writes both the FBI K9 series as Sarah Driscoll and the Abbott and Lowe Forensic Mysteries. And Jen's 11th book, the FBI K9's number 5, Leave No Trace, will come out on December 29th. Okay, now Carol Goodman. She's the author of an impressive 22 novels. She's won the Hammett Prize and the Mary Higgins Clark Award twice. Her books have been translated into no less than 16 languages. She lives in the Hudson Valley with her family. She teaches literature and writing at the New School and SUNY New Paltz. I hope that's pronounced correctly. And her latest novel, The Sea of Lost Girls, kept me up reading late into 2 consecutive nights. I lost a lot of sleep reading that book.
Oh, thank you.
And we have Michael Kaufman, who is the author or editor of 9 books. He lives in Toronto, and over the past 4 decades, his work to engage men to promote women's rights and violence against women has taken him to 50 countries with United Nations, governments, NGOs, and women's organizations. And his first mystery, The Last Exit, we have another exit, is set in Washington, D.C. in the year 2033, which sounds like it's a long time in the future. That's only 13 years. Wow. It's kind of sci-fi, too, with a detective, Jen B. Lowe, who has an experimental synthetic brain implant named Chandler. And I'm Sheila Lowe. I started studying handwriting in 1967, which makes me very old. And I testify in cases of forgery as a handwriting expert. So given the advice to write what you know, my forensic handwriting psychological suspense series features Claudia Rose, whose work mirrors mine. Book number 8, Dead Letters, will be out later this year. I'm not sure when, but sometime. And I also write a new paranormal suspense series called Beyond the Veil. This one is Proof of Life, where dead people nag the protagonist into helping them. So, having said all that, we're here to talk about evidence, apparently, and stuff like that. Evidence can come from a wide range of sources and has to do broadly with forensics. So why don't we start with the most basic question? What is evidence, and how does your character use it? Anyone can jump in. We'll make this a discussion. So
I can start if you want. I write 2 series that are fairly evidence-based. The Abbott and Lowe Forensic Mysteries, for starters, is a mystery that's based around, or a series that's based around forensic anthropology. So forensic anthropology is the study of human remains that are decomposed, skeletonized, dismembered, that kind of thing. And forensic anthropology is like a subset of physical anthropology, but when it's applied to sort of medical legal problems. So the evidence in that series is all it's all bone-based. What happens when you have either skeletonized remains or worse, burned remains, and then you have to get through to the bones. How can you read physical identification, time of death, method of death? How can you get all of that from the bones? So that's that one series. The other series is a search and rescue canine series, and in that case, the evidence is scent. Dogs are pretty amazing, and so they do tracking and trailing to find sometimes deceased people, hopefully live people. And so in that case, the evidence is something that we can't see. It's something that we can't even detect. Only the dogs can, and that's the way that the evidence comes into that series.
Okay. Anyone else want to talk about how you use evidence? What is evidence in your case?
Well, I'll out myself as being not writing such evidence-based writing to begin with, because I always have amateur detectives. So I'll start out by saying that I don't have the expertise of most of my fellow panelists. So I write psychological suspense standalone. So my amateur detective is really what she's looking at as evidence is really just what people say and do around her. So it is a very different definition of evidence. And the only place where I think it becomes where the question of new technology really comes in is in looking at social media and looking at the evidence of what's posted, what she's reading, and the question with that, of course, comes up: what can you trust?
And yeah, when you think about it, the backbone of so much mystery writing from the very beginning has been the evidence that's not just in the technology, embedded in technology, but embedded in our brains, our capacity as humans to make connections, to understand nuances, but also figure out someone is lying or not, to try to get beneath people's skin. And so, I think that this whole question of evolving evidence and what we consider evidence is such a complex one, because it gets right into where sort of technology actually clashes with humanity and human instincts, and I think that can give some really interesting tension to a lot of our work.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I would agree.
Do you have anything you want to add to that, Catherine? Because you have to unmute. You're muted. There you go. You got it.
Sorry about that. Told you I was a newbie at this. So I write cozy mysteries, and going with what Carol was saying about her books, mine aren't as much evidence-based as, say, thrillers or more natural mysteries. I'm fascinated with DNA, actually. I've used DNA in a few of my novels, which and a couple of cold cases, things like that, which I can get more into later. But my character, obviously, she follows a trail of clues. She always has a police officer who is supporting her, or mostly discouraging her, saying, leave it alone, leave it alone. But all of her cases have to do with either a family member or a friend or someone that she's trying to help. And I've used I'll just give a quick example. Like, there was one situation where I had a hit and run in a novel, and it turned out it wasn't a hit and run. It was intentional. And she was able to help prove that with the help of her police officer friend, because of the tire tracks, and he was able to tell from that the car had not tried to stop. It had increased speed. So going along those lines, I mean, mine are pretty basic compared to some of you, obviously, but I think in most mysteries it does come into play somewhere. So
That's true, it does, and evidence can cover such a wide range, from DNA to what you just said, tire tracks. In my case, handwriting evidence. Yeah, it goes far afield.
Sheila, are you able to tell if, for example, say that you have an autographed baseball from Babe Ruth, are you able to tell if it's really his signature or something like that? Or
When it comes to sports memorabilia, I send those to somebody else who's a specialist, because so many of those things are not genuine. I mean, there are some things that I will do, but when it comes to sports, I don't want to get into that. But yeah, because handwriting signatures can change over time, and so you have to really know what that person's range of variation is.
Interesting.
Can you sort of tell us what the evidence is in your books? Like if you're dealing with forensic handwriting, what exactly are you dealing with? Because that's new to me.
Yeah. Well, there's actually two areas that I work in, and my character works in, and that's handwriting authentication, where the evidence is actually the signatures, usually, or it could be an anonymous note, or anything to do with handwriting. But the other area is personality assessment, and so then you're looking for things like personality disorders that could come as evidence in a plot.
Interesting.
Wow.
Thank you for asking. Technology is a huge help for investigators. Can it replace the human touch? How do you address the evolving world of evidence in your books? I mean, Michael, you certainly have taken this to a long way. And I have a character in one of my books who has a brain implant, but that's an unwilling one. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, in my book set in DC in 2033, my detective Jen Lowe has, as part of an experiment, having this implant into her neocortex that helps process things. It's her comms link, second set of eyes and ears, as it were, and it's both a fun element, as this guy is, as you can guess by his nickname, as you heard, Chandler, is this wannabe tough guy, which is hard for him to pull off because he's only 2.5 years old. But it's more than a fun element. I mean, it is a bit dystopian. I mean, who wants to be walking around with? We have enough voices in our head already as authors, don't we? Without yet another one. But I think what it does for me is raise this question that is, I mean, I wrote this before Black Lives Matter, but it seems so relevant now in terms of, what police say happened in a certain situation and what we increasingly know actually did happen. And so, I think, I hope we don't get to that, implants in people's brains, unless you've got Parkinson's or something. But it's, I think that we are dealing in an era where there's both good use of new technologies and pretty damn scary use of technologies. I mean, this is, we're seeing increasingly a surveillance society, which is leading a lot of us worried. It also creates some plot dilemmas for many writers if everyone can all see what's happening everywhere. But it's something that in The Last Exit I both play with and question.
Well, when I was researching for the book where I wrote about the brain implant, I learned that they have been doing experiments with brain implants since the 70s. Yeah. So wow. It's already here.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's so interesting, Michael, to talk about that in terms of Black Lives Matter and in terms of the evidence of people taking videos. And this is not something I have used in a book, but the idea of witnesses taking videos of events that then are later used to, to reveal what happened. And also videos that we see online that may have been manipulated, or the power of that. And it seems as if that would be, or police wearing police cams, that would be the definitive, then we would know what happened, but yeah. Probably not. So I think that's interesting as an evolving, and I'm beginning to think of a plot as I,
well, we're all going to come out with a book on that.
Well, and your point about the surveillance state is well taken. The book that I'm writing right now, the next FBI Canine book, takes place in Philadelphia. And just in downtown Philadelphia, you can look it up, there's these maps that you can find. There's over 600 community cameras. And just trying to get around, so you actually have to build into the storyline the fact that you have to avoid these cameras because at least, I mean, this is in the downtown core where like the business core and the historic district. You can't do anything there without somebody watching over your shoulder. Forget about someone with a cell phone. So that's certainly an evolving sort of technology. 15 years ago, that wasn't an issue.
In the UK, there are 6 million cameras.
Oh, I know. They're
In
even
London,
more
there are
than
5
America.
million.
Yeah, yeah. So
when I watch a British movie or British mystery show, it's always go to the CCTV. Yeah. And I was not aware either how many cameras are here. I thought of, oh, that's something they have over there. But I interviewed a police officer once about what do you do if there's a hit and run, and because in a previous book, River Road, that was the issue. And he said, oh, I'd first go look at the camera that's over, on Main Street. And I was like, I didn't know there was a camera on Main Street. But yes.
And
like I
Carol,
said,
you
there's a
mentioned,
website where you can look them all up given the city that you're in. So if you're interested, I can send you that link.
you mentioned people taking videos of crimes and police brutality and so on, and that becomes evidence sometimes in the court case. So yeah, things are really evolving. And you just reminded me, sometime by the end, I've got a link that I'm going to put in the chat, and it's a site with all kinds of resources on gathering evidence, and it's got some pretty cool stuff on there, including some videos. Does anybody have any pet peeves about evidence gathering or how you use it? Catherine, you unmuted, so I'm guessing you want to say something.
I don't know about pet peeves. I was just going to give an example of how I had used the DNA in one of mine, but if I'm off track, that can wait.
No, please do.
Okay. So in one of my books, it's a cold case, and the protagonist is invited to her 25th high school reunion. And she had a friend, her best friend, who actually committed suicide days before their graduation. And in the book, she goes to the 25th reunion, and they had planted a time capsule 25 years earlier, and they planned to open it that night at the reunion. And she finds a note in there from him. And I don't want to say exactly what the note said, but it does confirm to her that he never committed suicide. She just knows that he must have been murdered. So of course that takes her off to investigate, and she finds the police detective who had investigated it from 25 years earlier. He's retired now, and he tells her too, he confides that he never felt right about it either. He had tried to tell his boss at the time that he thought that there was something more to it, but it basically, I don't want to say got swept under the rug, and this all happened in the mid-'80s. And I think the first DNA case was actually, where it was used was 1986 in a case of a rape and murder. From what I've read, I believe that it was 1986. So of course,
PCR as a technology for profiling didn't come about until the very late 80s and wasn't used in court cases until the 90s. So that must have been a slightly different thing. But yeah, when you're talking about in the 80s, it was not possible.
Yeah, and that's why in her, so this happened before, obviously, DNA came about, and the police officer tells her, well, if there's any way you can find traces of clothing or anything from that day, any types of evidence, you might be able to find some clues. So she actually is able to locate the baseball hat he was wearing that day, and it must have been preserved, obviously, because I don't think it would have stood up in the 25 years. And he takes it in to have it examined for her, and they find hairs on it that belong to someone else. And that's not the major clue, but it leads into who she suspects and takes her down the right track. So that in that way, she was able to use it. And like I said, I just find the whole concept of it fascinating. And I don't always use these, and sometimes, of course, in cozy mysteries, the character will stumble across it, or she'll find a red herring, which leads her in the right direction. But in that case, I really enjoyed writing that. And I've done a couple of cold case ones, actually.
Really good. Someone has asked, Vicki has asked me to give an example of how handwriting is used in detecting personality disorders. So I actually wrote a whole book on that, a nonfiction book on on that subject. So it's a very big subject, but basically in the diagnostic and statistical manual that psychologists use to diagnose, and I'm not a licensed psychologist, so I can't make diagnoses, but each personality disorder, like obsessive compulsive or histrionic or bipolar or whatever they call it now, it's yeah, my mind has gone blank on that. But all of the personality disorders, each one has a description of the behaviors. And because behavior is seen in handwriting, if you get a cluster of those behaviors, then that tends to lead towards a diagnosis if you have the license to do that. Otherwise, all I do as a handwriting analyst is describe personality behaviors as they appear on the page. So that is describing that person as they were at the time of writing. And handwriting can change with moods, but it changes over a long period of time as you grow and change. So I don't know if that answers, but that's my answer.
Sheila, does this mean I should stop dotting my I's with a little heart?
Never stop. Never.
I was just thinking none of us should ever send any handwritten letters to Sheila.
Everybody says, it's okay. I've been doing it for over 50 years. I only do it when I'm paid now.
What will happen when a lot of my students well, not a lot so far, but I have students now who say they can't read cursive. So when handwriting disappears, not only can't they write it, they can't read it.
They're not taught it.
That's so.
They're not taught cursive anymore, so that's probably the reason why they can't read
That's
it.
crazy.
Okay.
Oh my gosh.
These are
The good
college
news
students who work
is that 26 states are now requiring cursive training, and there is legislation pending for others. Only 10 states have absolutely no requirement. So handwriting is not going to disappear.
That's good.
Good.
So back to you.
I was getting a little frightened of.
Yeah. How is using evidence different when your character is in law enforcement or is not? Is there a difference?
Am I the only one writing a police procedural? Does anyone else write them?
I have a police person in my books, but
Yeah, my protagonist is a police officer, but it's not just it's not. I wouldn't quite call it a procedural. It's more of a thriller.
Yeah, for me, there's all of the. I went to the PI panel yesterday, and they were talking about how great it was to not have to follow all these rules. So yeah, those are the rules I have to follow. Evidence marking and chain of custody and all of that. It certainly does make it a little more awkward. There's not as much freedom to just sort of grab stuff and run. So it does definitely make it a little harder. In some ways it's, once you learn the framework, you work within the framework, but it certainly can make things a little harder because everything has to be by the book unless you want to have a detective who is, one of those rogue detectives, and you can only do that so far.
yeah. Well, Carol, you have a detective in the book that I just read. You write standalones.
Right.
You don't have a series, do you?
No, I do not. Well, except in fantasy, it's a different. Not my fantasy, but I've written fantasy series, but I've never written a detective series. But yes, I often do what Catherine said. So she does. We have a police officer who comes in as a character, and sometimes as the love interest. Just so happens, or sometimes not. No spoiler alerts. But so my characters have to, if there's going to be something that is that sophisticated or requires requires an expert, then usually a murder has happened or a disappearance has happened, and the police have become involved, and the main character may then go in Sea of Lost Girls. She is actually, her contact with the police is a bit antagonistic at first because she suspects that they are looking at her son as a person of interest. So she can get information from him, but she also might be concerned about giving information to him. So there is more of the relationship to the police, which I think is also an interesting to look at in mystery novels and how that continues to evolve. I heard Tana French talking recently about how she has written her, gone away from her murder squad her Dublin Murder Squad mysteries, and is looking at the protagonist in her new book as a retired American cop. So our relationship with the police, I think that is evolving, and for the character, the amateur detective will need to go to that expert or work with that person, but that relationship may or may not be collaborative or contentious.
Yeah, when you think about it, that history of mystery writing, there's been that tension, hasn't there, from the, some of the original stories, the Sherlock Holmes stories of the amateur detective, and the inspector is a bit of a dolt and incompetent.
Right.
And to just wonderful police procedurals, P.D. James and so on, and many U.S. writers. I think that there's a third alternative that we're going to really need to I hope to see in the years ahead, and that's the cop that is not conflicted in some of the cliche ways, but is beginning to question the thin blue line, is beginning to question this idea that, well, it's us against the world. I'm going to be one of the boys. I'm not going to speak out against the injustice being committed within the ranks. And it's interesting. One of the things, part of the backstory for The Last Exit is there's a bit of an uprising. This is before the story, but in the mid-20s in the Washington, D.C. Police Department against police brutality. That's an uprising by officers in concert with the civil rights movement, women's organizations, NGOs, unions, and it's one of those things you write. I'm sure all of you have had this experience as writers, where you write something, and of course, by the time the book comes out, a year or two later, something's happened, and readers are going to say, "Oh, you just copied, Black Lives Matter or something." But I think that there's some interesting things to be done, and it has to do with both, as I said before, what we take as evidence, but really sort of the nature of mystery writing. How we bring these not just the facts, ma'am, but the conflicts and contradictions of our society right into our work.
Yeah.
Yeah. It makes it so much more real when you do that.
Mm-hmm.
Were you going to say something, Jen?
No, I just was very much agreeing that
Yeah.
I mean, I've done a couple of author events lately, and a question that keeps coming up during these author events, and this is not evidence related, but it's related to what Michael is saying, is how are you dealing with writing a police procedural during today's social times?
Mm-hmm.
And it is, I mean, it's a question that a lot of readers are asking. It's a question that authors are sort of asking of themselves as they are writing. How does that affect the current society's view of the police? How is that affecting what you're writing? It's definitely something that you have to be sensitive to.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say that in each of my series, I use the police officer differently. I'm not a fan of, sometimes cozies make the police officer come off as an idiot. So I shy away from that completely. He's always a big help to the protagonist. In my Cookies and Chance series, it was one of those things where the cop was a potential love interest, but she went with someone else. But he remains a good friend, and he helps her along in each of the books. In my Italian Chef mystery series, the cop is actually her cousin, and he, of course, is always trying to take the approach that he doesn't want her to get involved, this and that. And in the first book in that series, her husband is actually murdered. At first they think it's an accident, but it turns out to be murder. So he tries to keep her out of it, but of course he can't. And then in my real estate series, Cindy York series, there's always a different cop in that one who isn't really a main character, but he's like the investigator I was saying in the cold case. So I try to use them each in a different way. And like I said, I just don't care for the ones that portray cops as an idiot or incompetent, because I think that's very untrue. So,
yeah.
Well, I learned early on about cardboard characters, because I know when I first started writing, I tended to make the bad guys really, really bad. And everybody has got to have, a fully rounded personality to make sense. very few people are all bad or all good, right?
Very true.
Okay. Well, I have to find another question, don't I? I was kind of curious, Michael. You've said that your futuristic series is not dystopian, and yet I've only read the beginning of it because it was a lot of reading to do. We see the effects of climate change and that, so it seemed kind of dark to me.
It's hard to think about the future. It's hard to think about the present without being a bit dystopian. Let's face it.
Yeah, true.
But what I want to avoid in writing a near future book is, even though I enjoy some of them, I am so sick of movies and books with, neon blinking in the, endless puddles and mists and, just nuclear, Armageddon and irreversible climate change. Those things take away hope and our capacity as humans to change the world. And as writers, my background is I'm an activist. I think it's. I'm not saying writers should be writing propaganda in our fiction. That would get rather boring. But I want to write a near future book that both has that, sort of a realistic continuation of all the crap that is going on now, but with some sense of our capacity, both as individuals and collectively, to bring about change. Mm-hmm. And, there's that thing again in the world of mysteries of the heroic individual who just does it all. And that's, it's fun. It's gratifying to read. But, let's face it, the world is going to change when it's more than just this, Lone Ranger riding off to save the world, but that we collectively find ways to change the world. So my book, The Last Exit, isn't a grim dystopia. I want it to be exciting. I want it to be thoughtful. I want it to be lots of fun to read. I promise you, if you read on, it won't you won't be sort of searching for the razor blade cabinet or something.
I will definitely read on. Yeah. And I recommend others do too. All of you are great writers. I just wish I had time to read all the books.
One thing's fun about being on a panel, it gives you, sort of both, to meet new writers and in terms of in person, but also in their works, but also an excuse to read some that you hadn't read before. So I've been enjoying reading all of you as well.
Cool. Jen, you mentioned about forensic anthropology, and we know it started in the 1980s. So
yeah,
is it something that's so technical like DNA, or do you still, is it still investigator driven?
Classically it's investigator driven. There are beginning to be some sort of technological advances. Forensic anthropology, it's actually kind of funny how it started, if you want to just look at sort of evolving from the beginning. Dr. Bill Bass, who a lot of people know is the gentleman who started the body farm at the University of Tennessee. And I think it was in 1977, he was called in because there was a grave robbing and there was a headless body that was sitting on top of a coffin that had been dug down 3 or 4 feet. And he looked at this body and it was partially decomposed, and he thought it was something that had been, decomposing for a number of weeks and that kind of thing. And he figured out what the age of this thing was and said, this is a fairly new body. And then data started to come out and the clothes were analyzed and they were all natural fabrics, and they actually found the skull, which had been missing previously, and it had been shot point blank range. And he realized that he was looking at a Civil War colonel's burial and had totally missed all of the signs of how old he was, off by like 160 years on the date of death. And that was when he realized that he didn't know enough about forensic anthropology and they needed to learn more, and that's how the body farm got started. And so from the body farm, pretty much everything that we know about forensic anthropology has come sort of forward from 1980. And so a lot of it is very investigator driven. It's, they would study decomposition, or how, if you would leave a body out over the seasons, how does that affect, the decomposition that would make you look back at time since death. Forensic entomology, forensic toxicology, you can take soil samples from under a body and sort of figure out how long it's been there based on the chemical composition of what's in the soil. So a lot of it is still sort of nuts and bolts, looking at the bones, figuring out kerf marks, and you can age based on bones. But there are some things that are now starting to come forward, like I think we've all seen sort of 3D facial reconstructions, where you would take the skull, they would put the skull markers on, that's sort of like a general population average based on gender and race and that kind of thing, and then they would build like a 3D reconstruction of the skull. There are some computer programs that are supposed to look at the pubic symphysis for aging in adults and sort of guesstimate that. But all of this is sort of like reproducing what the actual investigator himself or herself is doing. And by and large, that's still the best way.
Yes, machines help, but they'll never replace people.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like fingerprinting. I mean, fingerprinting, you can look through IAFIS and get sort of like a fingerprint match, but when it comes down to actually making, some sort of accusation based on the data from fingerprints, they go right back to the people, and you have to have 3 officers who agree through 3 different levels of analysis. Technology is great, but still the human brain is still the best way to go for most of this stuff.
Yeah. There's things
which figures into the plot of one of your recent books.
Yeah, it kind of does.
It does. Yeah. Carol, you have one of your characters surveilling her teenage son. So what do you think are the limits of that? How much should parents be surveilling their children?
Totally fictional. It is not like I would ever find my iPhone to track my daughter unless it's 1 a.m. and I know she's on the subway. So big disavowal. But yeah, that is my narrator has a teenage, Tess has a teenage son who is troubled. And if any of you are parents here, you are on the same phone plan with your teenagers, there is that option to use Find My iPhone to track their whereabouts. And is that, my narrator wrestles with that, and yet she succumbs to that. Of course, using that is going to compromise the trust she has with her teenage son. Obviously, he's going to be extremely angry about it. And I made fun of the idea of me using the Find My iPhone I have at 1 a.m, knowing back before COVID, and I knew my daughter was taking the subway home. I have, before I've gone to sleep, looked to see that she got home. And I've told her that I did it, and she's okay with that. Or at least now she's changed her plan. So maybe, maybe she wasn't so okay with it. But, I certainly, when I wrote the character Tess and knew that the book starts with her getting a text message from her son saying, "Come get me." And when she goes and gets him, she finds out that she finds him sitting at the edge of a cliff where the next morning, the body of his girlfriend is found. So he is thrust into, the possibility that he caused that death is evident to her, and her anxiety for him. I think there are points in what I had to think about is how unlikable would it make Tess if she's following her son, or how much we would understand that, given the background that we begin to learn between her and her son, that we, most of us might do it. So there is that, that is the option that we have now in this technological world to follow or watch or surveil somebody. Do you give into it if you think it's for a higher good? And on a bigger realm, who else might be doing that? Who else might be surveilling you to look? I mean, we're all being surveilled all the time, as we can tell by our pop-up ads, that our buying habits, et cetera, are being mined. So where does that, what are the ethics behind that?
Kind of scary.
It is scary.
Yes. Michael, a lot of your work over the years has focused on ending violence against women and protecting women's rights, for which I personally thank you, because my daughter was murdered in a case of domestic violence. So what are some of the major issues around evidence in that field? It's
interesting because we've put historically, a lot of situations have been turned into, she said, he said, she said type situation. Or, the problems of accumulating evidence in cases of wife assault, to have it at that moment when, a woman is absolutely terrified to call the police or go to the police. Or if the police come and do a house call, I mean, traditionally they would, come to the door and just say, is everything okay? And, a woman is standing there with her husband has just beat the crap out of her standing nearby. And she's going to say, no, it's not. So, one of our challenges, and I think it's a challenge both for anyone who's writing and has issues coming up in their books relating to violence against women, but it's also a public challenge and challenge to police and policymakers is changing the evidence, is thinking about the evidence base. So, for example, in Sweden now, there are laws around proving cases of violence against women. They can bring to court not only just sort of immediate evidence, but they'll interview neighbors and family members who will say, yeah, over the past year, my daughter has phoned, I'm sure, I don't know exactly, but it's, 10 times, and I can't give you dates, but to say that, she's, whatever. And so that type of, things that have traditionally been seen as more anecdotal, neighbors saying, yes, we hear her, screaming in terror or him screaming in anger, the importance of that type of evidence. So I think again it gets away from the technological questions, and those are good questions. I should add we've had some great ones popping up about sort of what digital evidence to use. I hope we have a minute to get into that, but a lot of this goes back to what humans can collect, what humans can understand, and how we have to really honor. We have to honor the evidence that is that in the past we haven't really seen as evidence at all.
Can I think that's so fascinating and so important, and the using and collecting what contemporary corroborating evidence in charges of sexual assault, as we've seen, it's become more important. Looking back and gathering evidence from the testimony of people who at the time were told or witnessed something in those cases of that very often don't have direct witnesses, but have corroborating contemporary evidence of people who knew about or heard or were told by the victim at the time that was happening. And enough of that gathered together does then make a compelling argument for what happened. So I think that's really important.
Indeed. We have a couple minutes before we start questions. Is there anything that you haven't said that you would like to say before we get into answering questions?
You asked about pet peeves.
Oh, yeah. We didn't get to that, did we?
I'm the only scientist on the panel, so let me tell you, I have some. And someone had asked, how accurate are the Temperance Brennan stories? I think that was how the question was described. Yeah, the story. So my answer to that one was that Kathy Reichs is a forensic anthropologist herself, so anything that's in any of her books is really accurate. But when you look at something like the TV show Bones, it got to the point when I was watching it with my daughters that I was basically sworn to silence. They're like, stop talking, stop telling us everything that's wrong. I think TV is probably is a little bit worse at this than books are. Books either maybe hide it better or just don't have to deal with as many cases. But let me assure you, if you've watched CSI, PCR is not done in 3 minutes and in the dark. There's all sorts of stuff like that. So has anybody else got pet peeves about that kind of thing?
No, but we can consult you if we have questions in the future.
Feel free, yeah.
I've seen a couple of books that used handwriting analysts, and I wrote, and one of them was kind of a well-known author, and I wrote to them and complained because they made the character, they put her on a witness stand and made her look like a fortune teller. That really ticked me off. Or they'll say things about handwriting that simply are not true, or things that you cannot tell You can't tell everything from handwriting. You can tell a lot about the past. You can't tell the future, except as how present behavior can, be predicted. And you can't predict it, but you can say it may lead to that. But
have you read any books besides your own that handle that sort of well?
not that come to mind right away. So if anybody's writing a book that involves a handwriting analyst, please feel free to contact me with questions.
I plan to.
One thing that came up in one of the panels yesterday, which I think is worth repeating, and it came up with, it was responding to some questions around evidence and around either real things that could be done to figure something out, or people's, ideas gleaned from TV about how quickly things can happen or how things can happen at all. And one of the person talking about it made a terrific point and just said, if you've got to think about as writers, what the readers are going to be thinking. So if there's a certain point and the reader's going to think, well, why don't they just check for DNA? You've got to answer that. If you're not going to be checking for DNA, you've got to have someone say, well, let's just check for DNA. And someone says, yeah, that's going to take, a week or a month or cost too much or whatever. But to have those answers built into, like for writers, we have to anticipate those questions and concerns. And I'm racking my brain to think who made this point. But anyway, it was a great point yesterday.
I think it was Hank, wasn't it? Hank Philippi Ryan who made that point?
It was definitely that panel.
Yeah. And it's true and that's one thing that's come out of things like CSI or Bruns, sort of these more easily accessible TV shows, is that readers are also a lot more savvy about the sciences, even if it's not quite accurate. They're a lot more savvy about sort of the different options within science and evidence, so that you do need to hang a lantern on something if you're not going to use it, so that readers also don't question it, because readers are smart.
I mean, there's nothing worse than having someone call you out on something that isn't true in one of your books. Fortunately, I haven't had it happen to me, but anyone who reads cozy mysteries know that they have a habit of stretching the truth at times. So I always try to take a realistic approach in mine. I always get sources when I'm not sure about something, because I don't want to see that happen to me, and I don't want to embarrass myself that way.
There is actually something worse than that. It's when they call you out for something that you got right, and they they'll put some big review on there saying, no, this is wrong, and it's right.
Well, then you have the satisfaction of telling them that they're wrong.
Yeah. True. Let me call on our host, Terry. Do we have the questions, or do I just scroll back through here and find, because we've got a bunch.
Yes, I think I just sent them to you. But there's a couple that I've seen that haven't been answered yet. Is there a new technology or evidence technique that you find necessary to include in your stories?
So, would you please repeat that, because I didn't get all of it.
Sure. Is there a new technology or evidence technique that you find necessary to include in your stories, and how easy or challenging do you find that incorporation?
Oh, who wants to get that one? New technology. I think we've talked about some of the new technologies.
I'll just, and as the, non-expert, I'll just say that in this last book, my narrator is teaching at a boarding school. So I just wanted to make sure that I had all my social media up to date, what teenagers were using. So I will always ask my daughter or my students, what are teenagers using? It's not Facebook. So, get a sense of what
Facebook's for old people.
Exactly.
That's what I've been told by my kids.
Basically, if we know how to use it, it's out of date already.
Exactly.
I'll just get that out of the way as my very minor technological. So I try to figure out, have my students explain again what TikTok is. So, but then that'll be dated if TikTok is gone. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the dilemmas, is how specific you get mentioning social media, because, by the time someone might be reading it in 5-6 years, it's going to not only be gone, but have a whole different social connotation.
It'll sound like MySpace.
Yeah.
Well, even possibly in the time between you write it and it gets published. Like
Yeah.
that 18-month window, things can change very quickly.
Yeah.
That's right.
One of the listeners, Dell, says it's never a good idea to tell the reviewers they're wrong. Let me just specify that when I said I would tell them, or I'm sure Carol means the same thing, I'm not talking about you're wrong in your opinion. If you're telling me I'm wrong about a fact, I will correct you. That's not the same as saying, I didn't like this book. And I say, well, you should have. You know?
I agree. And that's what I meant as well. And I actually wasn't even thinking of reviewers as much as people who write you letters or messages say that you got this wrong. And I'm always very respectful.
Of course.
No. Maybe personally I might be going, no.
Okay, here's a question. Is there a database somewhere where all of us authors who can and are willing to consult with fellow authors on special topics like this? And there is a group, and I don't know the name of it.
Writers Police Academy, there you can get help in there if that's what you mean.
Yeah, but there's a it's, I don't know if it's a Google group or one of those where professionals from different organizations are there willing to help. But I'm sure with a little bit of research, you could find it. And I'm sorry, I don't know it. Let's see some of the other questions here.
Well, you're looking at that, one of the pet peeves that came up, which was nice. Harold Emanuel said, TV shows where computers work instantly. Yeah, you know.
Yeah.
One of the things I think, for writers, in particular new writers, to be thinking about is to know that you're creating your world in your book. And so, there's this endless range of technical possibilities now to solve crimes or to investigate. And part of what we do as writers is we're creating fictional worlds, and part of that fictional worlds is making our choices about what to include and what not to include. And partly it's a style of book, whether it's something that's very heavy, as Jen's book on forensic detail, Sheila's on handwriting expertise and so forth. But partly it's just within your fictional world, there's only so much you can bite off. And there's only so much you want to bite off because you don't want to just be throwing in elements to show that you're up in all the latest technology. So make those choices, live with them, acknowledge what can't be there perhaps, but not get too caught up in trying to make use of technology, particularly if you don't have that expertise.
Thank you. Bren asks, do you think the introduction of social media has changed how you write mysteries or how you plot your clues?
Well, as I've said it already, it has for me. It's big, especially dealing with, situations in schools where teenagers are involved because they are so plugged in to social media that it would be unrealistic to have that not be an element. So it, is very much a part of that. But I also think what Michael said is true, that you can, decide what your world is. And one of the things I've done sometimes is limit the world by having it in either a location or a situation where not all of that might be available. So you could be on an island without cell phone service, or, a storm where your internet has gone down. So there are ways to, or you could set it, 20 years ago. So there are ways of limiting that world if that is not what you want to be the emphasis.
Yeah. In my new book that's coming out, the 18-year-old niece of my protagonist goes missing on an archaeological dig in Egypt. And she talks to her best friend and said, the character Claudia, and the friend says, well, did you check her Instagram? It's like, she has an Instagram account? You have to bring some of that stuff in, even if you don't know a lot about it. And I notice a lot of people are putting a lot of good resources in the chat. So be sure, if you don't know how to save the chat, go down to the bottom of the chat window. There's 3 little dots. Click on that and click Save Chat. And it'll save everything since you came into the room. And it will be in the Zoom folder on your computer. Actually, when you save it, it'll pop up a thing and ask you if you want to open the folder.
Thank you.
Yeah, this chat in particular has been a really rich one. I've been following. I think all of us have, and having watched a number of panels, this has been some of the richest chats going on. It's really interesting. So thank you to everyone.
We drew a really good group. Yeah. Congratulations to all of us. Okay, what else do we have here? I know there were some others. We have 5 more minutes to finish up. Why don't we end by everybody just briefly telling what you've got coming up, and if you want to show a book cover, this is be the time. Catherine.
Oh, okay. I actually have a book coming out on Tuesday.
Wow.
I'm co-writing a book with Gemma Halliday, who publishes 3 of my 4 series, and it's one of her high heels books. It's Jeopardy in High Heels, about a contestant on America's favorite game show who is murdered. It is hilarious, and I think after the year we've all had, that everybody needs a laugh. So you might want to check it out. Other than that, for me, my latest book came out in July. It Can Only Be Murder, which is the second book in my, you gotta love the puns for cozy mysteries. This was my second book in my Italian chef series. First book was Penne Dreadful. And this book deals with a bookstore and cannoli and an old nemesis who was murdered in the bookstore, and takes place in upstate New York. The first book was the one I was telling about, where the main character's husband was murdered in Penny Dreadful. And other than that, next year will be my next release in the Cookies and Chance books, and that will be number 10. And I'm working on the first draft for that now.
Wonderful. Thank you. Jen.
So my first book in the NYPD Negotiator series, Exit Strategy. It's the only series that I couldn't talk about today because it has really nothing to do with evidence. It's all about hostage negotiation. So that is set within the NYPD. Gemma Capello is part of an NYPD-based Italian-Sicilian family, and that book kicks off when a suspect takes hostages inside of New York City Hall. And so that is book 1 of the NYPD Negotiators. The second book in that series, Shot Caller, will be coming out next August, is what I've got so far. The next book in my FBI Canine series, Leave No Trace, will come out at the end of the year. And so that is it for me.
That's a lot.
Very good. And I suggest we each put our website in the chat before we go.
Oh, Terry already did me. Thank you, Terry.
Okay. Carol, you want to go next?
Yes. So my latest book is The Sea of Lost Girls. I realize I don't have mirroring on this. So that came out in March, right on the eve of the pandemic. My next book is The Stranger Behind You, which is coming out, I think it's June 21st. It's next summer, 21.
Well, Michael.
Yeah, well, as you heard, my first mystery, my next book is The Last Exit, coming out in January. And let me just say to any new writers who are listening, and this is my first mystery, this is, the mystery writing community is unbelievable. It's, the number of really high profile writers who say, oh yeah, I'm happy to blurb and I'm happy to read it. It's so exciting, and it's a welcoming community, wonderful community. Anyway, The Last Exit.
Fantastic. And I've mentioned that my next book, Dead Letters, comes out sometime, but I have a new audiobook coming out, which is, we've been working backwards through my series, and this is the second one. We only got the first book in the series to go, but Written in Blood, it's coming out any day now. Kat says, my pet peeve, unspeak, every sentence ends up sounding like a question. Yes, I get that.
Real life? Are we talking about our pet peeves in real life? Because
we got plenty.
We don't have time.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for their participation, for all of the panelists and for the attendees who came to hear us.
Thank you for moderating.
Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the moderation.
Thank you. We'll see you in another
Thanks,
panel.
attendees. You had great questions.
Yes. So I think we're at we have 1 minute. If there's anything else you want to say, otherwise we're done.
Oh, thanks again, Sheila. You did a fabulous job moderating.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
you made it easy because you gave me all good questions. All right.
Good. See you all next year in person.
Everyone
Yeah,
be well.
hopefully.
Yes.
Take care, everyone.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Next year and wherever.
Bye.